The first rays of dawn stretched across the endless plains, painting the dusty horizon in shades of gold and amber. Elijah Turner, a solitary rancher with the lines of loss etched deep into his weathered face, moved slowly among his cattle, the chill of the morning air biting at his skin. Life had been unkind, leaving him alone on this unforgiving stretch of the Wild West, scraping by with the meager harvest of his land. A sudden rustle in the dry grass caught his attention. Through the haze of sunrise, he saw a figure delicate, wary, and unmistakably out of place. A young Apache woman, thin and trembling, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. Something in her gaze stirred a long-buried compassion in Elijah. A single choice, a simple act of mercy, hung on the edge of this quiet morning, ready to tip the balance of his lonely world. What would happen if he reached out? Could kindness in a land ruled by harshness carry consequences no one could foresee? Before we dive into the story, let us know your location and the local time in the comments below. And if you love tales of the Wild West, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories. The morning sun climbed slowly, burning through the thin veil of mist that hugged the dry plains. Elijah Turner stood near the corral, his rough hands gripping the worn wooden rails, eyes fixed on the figure still lingering at the edge of the pasture. She was barely more than a shadow among the sagebrush and tumbleweeds, yet every movement she made was deliberate, cautious. Her dark hair tangled and dusty fell around her shoulders, and her brown eyes held a quiet intelligence that contrasted sharply with the fear that clung to her body like a second skin. Elijah's heart tightened. He had seen many things in his 44 years, many men and women hardened by the cruelty of the frontier, but never anyone quite like this. There was something fragile about her, yet in that fragility a stubborn resilience glimmered. He had just enough food left in his larder, for himself a small hunk of bread, a bit of smoked meat, but as he watched her shiver, it became clear that nothing in the world mattered more than offering her a chance at life. Slowly he stepped forward, hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. "Hey there," he said, voice roughened by years of dust and wind. "You look like you could use a meal." He waited, the silence stretching between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the occasional gust of wind kicking up dry soil into small, spinning whirlwinds. The woman's eyes widened, and she took a hesitant step closer as though weighing the danger against her desperation. She didn't speak, didn't even nod. Instead, she lifted her hands slightly, almost imperceptibly, and then lowered them again, a silent acceptance that made Elijah's chest ache with a mixture of relief and trepidation. He walked to his cabin and returned with the small bundle of food, careful to keep his movements slow, unthreatening. Placing it on a flat rock, he stepped back, nodding to indicate she could take it. For a long moment, she simply stared, her gaze flicking between the food and Elijah's face. Then, almost reverently, she knelt and began to eat small bites that betrayed her extreme hunger. Elijah watched her, noting the grace with which she moved, even in weakness. Her hands, delicate yet calloused in places from obvious hardship, moved with precision, and her eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes, occasionally flicked up to meet his, carrying a silent thankfulness that needed no words. He had never known anyone like her, a presence that could command attention without a single uttered sound. As she ate, Elijah's mind wandered back to the years he had spent alone on this ranch. The death of Margaret, his wife, had left a gaping hole in his life. Her laughter, her careful tending of the animals, the way she could make even the harshest winter day feel warm and safe, those memories lingered like ghosts. And yet here in the dawn light with this stranger, this girl who had known fear in a way he had never truly understood, he felt something stir in his chest. Compassion, yes, but also a spark of hope, fragile as it was, that perhaps life could still offer unexpected gifts. Aiyana, though he didn't yet know her name, paused from eating to look around as if sensing she was not entirely alone. Her ears seemed attuned to sounds Elijah hadn't noticed, the distant caw of a raven, the faint creak of a corral gate swinging in the wind, the soft whistle of the prairie breeze through the dry grass. Then her eyes met his again, and there was a quiet communication in that glance, a wordless acknowledgement that she trusted him at least for this fleeting moment. Elijah felt the weight of responsibility settle upon him. He had always been self-reliant, proud of his ability to survive in the unforgiving expanse of the Wild West, yet suddenly he was faced with a choice that tested his very nature: offer aid to the stranger and risk drawing danger upon himself, or turn away and leave her to the mercies of the harsh land. The decision was almost instinctive. He couldn't leave her here. All right, he said softly, more to himself than to her. "Come with me. I've got a cabin. You can rest there." He gestured toward the small, weather-beaten structure that had been his home for more than a decade. The offer hung in the morning air like a fragile promise, uncertain yet necessary. Aiyana stood slowly, a faint shiver running through her. She hesitated, one foot in the open, the other tentatively stepping toward him. There was a moment, a heartbeat where the wind seemed to pause, as if the very land was holding its breath. Then, with a quiet determination, she walked toward him, every step deliberate, every movement measured. Elijah felt a tightening in his chest, a mix of awe and caution. Here was someone whose very survival depended on him now, yet whose presence awakened something in him he hadn't felt in years, a need to protect, to care, to connect. As they approached the cabin together, Elijah cast his eyes toward the horizon, a habit born of years, living on the edge of civilization. The plains stretched endlessly beautiful and merciless in equal measure. He couldn't shake the feeling that eyes might be watching them, hidden among the sagebrush, or riding far off in the distance. Danger had a way of finding the smallest acts of kindness out here, and he knew the choice to help Aiyana could ripple far beyond this quiet morning. Inside the cabin, he set the remaining food on a rough wooden table, and Aiyana accepted the gesture with the same silent grace she had shown outside. She looked at the modest interior, the simple furnishings, the warm hearth, the absence of other human presence, and seemed to understand the sanctuary he was offering. There were no words exchanged, yet the connection between them grew stronger with every small gesture. A shared glance, a careful nod, the quiet acknowledgement that they were for this moment companions against the vast loneliness of the world outside. Elijah stepped back, letting her move freely, but his eyes never left her. Something about her presence unsettled him, but in a way that wasn't fear, it was anticipation, a quiet curiosity about what this encounter could lead to. He knew deep down that life on the plains was rarely simple, that every choice carried weight. And yet he felt an unexplainable certainty that this decision to feed her, to shelter her, was the right one. And then, as the morning light slanted across the cabin floor, casting long shadows over the rough boards, a faint sound reached Elijah's ears, a distant thud like hooves against hard-packed earth. He froze, muscles tensing, senses sharpening. Was it the wind, a herd moving, or something else entirely? Aiyana noticed too, her eyes narrowing slightly, scanning the window with a cautious intensity. Whatever it was, the peaceful moment had shifted. Elijah's heart beat faster, but alongside it was a growing sense of resolve. No matter what the day or the land might bring, he would stand by her side. A simple act of sharing a meal had changed the course of this morning, and perhaps he realized, with a mix of awe and apprehension, the course of everything to come. The distant sound grew louder, sharper, and with it came a ripple of unease. Out there beyond the horizon, the world waited, indifferent and watchful. And Elijah knew that in the next few hours, their quiet sanctuary might be tested in ways neither of them could yet imagine. What was approaching, friend-foe, or something in between? The answer would reveal itself soon, and when it did, neither Elijah nor Aiyana would ever be the same. The morning settled into a warm haze, the sun climbing higher and painting the plains in gold and amber hues. Inside the small cabin, Elijah Turner watched Aiyana as she moved cautiously through the modest space, her dark eyes taking in every detail. Each corner, every wooden beam and dusty shelf seemed to tell her story of unfamiliarity. And yet, despite her wariness, there was a rhythm to her movements, a quiet confidence that hinted at the strength she carried beneath the surface. Elijah busied himself with chores, though his attention constantly drifted toward her. He had never shared his home with anyone other than the memory of Margaret, his late wife, whose presence lingered in the corners and smelled faintly of the lavender she had loved. Now, in her place was this young Apache woman, a living, breathing puzzle, silent, yet demanding, in her way, of simply existing. Her silence was not emptiness. It was filled with thought, observation, and a depth that challenged him more than words ever could. After a while, he stepped over to a small crate of dried meat and bread he had prepared, setting it carefully on the table. "You should eat again," he said gently, his voice low, careful not to startle her. Aiyana hesitated, eyes scanning his face for intent. Then, with the same cautious grace she had shown outside, she reached for the food, picking at it in deliberate, measured bites. Her hands moved slowly, but every motion was precise, controlled, as though she had survived on careful calculation alone. Elijah studied her as she ate. There was a quiet dignity in her posture, a steadfastness that refused to crumble even in the face of hunger and uncertainty. He thought of the harsh world outside these walls, the endless plains, the scorching sun, the merciless winds, and he realized how fragile she must have felt surviving alone in such a land. Yet she endured, and in that endurance she commanded respect. Hours passed in this quiet communion. Elijah kept himself busy fetching water, tending to the animals, yet all the while he felt a strange connection growing. It was unspoken, an understanding forged in the crucible of need and shared vulnerability. He caught glimpses of her past in the small gestures she made, how she handled the food, how she observed his routines, how she avoided the dust that clung stubbornly to every surface. There was a story behind every movement, every glance, and Elijah found himself wanting to read it. For her part, Aiyana studied him as much as he studied her. She had learned long ago that appearances were dangerous, that silence was often safer than speech. And yet in this quiet cabin she sensed something different. Elijah's eyes did not hold judgment, nor did his body radiate the harshness of a man hardened by violence. There was care attention and a tentative openness that drew her out of her self-imposed walls. She could not speak, but she could observe, and observation, she knew, was a form of communication in itself. By midday, the heat of the sun had warmed the cabin. Elijah moved to a corner where he kept extra blankets and gestured toward them. Aiyana approached slowly, her eyes flicking to his for confirmation. He nodded and she accepted the gesture, folding the rough blankets over her lap. In that simple act, a small bridge of trust was formed, a recognition that he meant no harm, and that she could for this moment rest without fear. They sat together in the quiet, the sounds of the prairie drifting in through the open window. A hawk circled above its cry, sharp and distant. The cattle lowed softly in the corral, and somewhere in the distance, a stream whispered its steady rhythm. Elijah's gaze kept returning to Aiyana, and he noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers twitched, as though ready to spring into action at any hint of danger. He understood that tension, for he had spent years on these plains, learning to survive the unpredictable. Yet the difference was that she was alone, and he felt an instinctual need to protect her, even as he marveled at the strength that belied her small frame. At one point, he placed his hand on the table palm down and tapped it lightly. Aiyana looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. He pointed toward the horizon, then toward himself, and finally toward her. Slowly she reached out and placed her hand near his, a silent acknowledgement of their shared presence. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. In the language of survival and trust, it was profound. Elijah could feel the weight of the day pressing against the walls of the cabin, the knowledge that the world outside was vast, harsh, and indifferent. And yet in this small sunlit space, a moment of connection had been forged. He allowed himself a rare smile, one that touched the corners of his eyes and softened the lines of grief that had etched themselves there over the years. For the first time in a long while, he felt that perhaps the world had more to offer than endless toil and solitude. Aiyana, for her part, seemed to relax slightly. She shifted, moving to sit cross-legged on the floor, still near the table, still within sight of him. Her eyes followed his movements, and she mirrored some of his gestures, small imitations that spoke of attentiveness, learning, and perhaps the beginnings of trust. She had not spoken a word, but in her presence, Elijah felt a dialogue unfolding rich and layered between two souls, bridging the gap of language and culture through gesture, observation, and shared experience. Outside, the prairie seemed to hold its breath. The wind shifted, carrying scents Elijah could barely identify: sagebrush, dry earth, distant smoke. He felt a prickle at the back of his neck, an instinct honed over years of solitary living. Something was approaching. He didn't know what it was, only that the world beyond these walls was never silent for long. Elijah moved toward the window, careful not to startle Aiyana, and peeked through the rough wooden slats. Dust swirled on the horizon, faint at first, then growing a telltale sign of movement. Horses, riders. He could not tell how many, but there was no mistaking the pattern, the deliberate cadence of hooves against packed earth, the rhythm of a force advancing. He stepped back slowly, placing a hand gently on Aiyana's shoulder. She looked up at him, alert and poised, and in that moment no words were necessary. They understood each other perfectly. A threat was coming, and they would face it together. Ni isi. His heart beat faster, a mix of fear and determination. She had trusted him, and he would honor that trust. Whatever waited beyond the cabin walls, he would not falter. As the shadows of the riders grew longer across the plains, Elijah grabbed his worn coat and reached for the rifle propped against the wall. Aiyana mirrored the readiness, moving to a corner near the window, scanning the horizon with the precision of someone who had survived much worse than he could imagine. Their combined presence in the cabin created a tense harmony. Two unlikely allies united by circumstance, preparing for the unknown. The distant figures moved closer, their intentions unreadable, yet the certainty of their arrival pressed upon the cabin like a weight. Elijah glanced at Aiyana, her dark eyes steady, unflinching. He nodded slightly, and she responded with a subtle tilt of her head. It was not just trust they had built, it was an unspoken promise to face whatever came together, to stand and meet the world on their own terms. And as the sound of hooves grew louder, mingling with the whisper of the wind and the faint cry of a distant hawk, Elijah knew one truth with absolute clarity. The quiet trust and connection forged over this single morning would soon be tested in ways neither of them could yet foresee. The plains outside waited vast and indifferent, but inside the cabin a fragile alliance had been formed, one that might just turn the tide of what was to come. The first rider cresting the hill became visible a shadow against the shimmering heat of the morning. Elijah tightened his grip on the rifle while Aiyana remained poised, every muscle ready. The moment stretched charged with anticipation as they waited for the next move, knowing that their quiet sanctuary was about to collide with the reality of the Wild West, a land where mercy and danger often arrived hand in hand. Who were these riders, friend or foe? And what would their arrival mean for the fragile trust between a lone rancher and the mute Apache woman who had wandered into his life? The answers hovered just beyond the horizon, waiting for the sun to climb higher and reveal the truths hidden in the dusty plains. The late morning sun beat down on the dry plains, the golden light stretching endlessly over the rolling hills and dusty trails. Elijah Turner remained at the cabin window, eyes narrowed against the glare, tracking the distant shapes that approached. The first rider had already crested the rise, and now more dust clouds formed behind him, a slow-moving army of silhouettes appearing on the horizon. Elijah's heart tightened. He had no way of knowing who they were, settlers, outlaws, or Apache scouts, but he knew that whatever was coming would change the morning, perhaps the entire day, in ways he could not yet predict. Inside the cabin, Aiyana shifted slightly, sensing his tension. Her dark eyes followed his gaze, noting every detail, every subtle movement in the distance. Though she had remained silent since he had first offered her food, her body spoke volumes, poised, alert, ready. Elijah felt the unspoken communication between them, a fragile trust forged in a single act of kindness and strengthened through quiet observation. She was wary yet confident, and he knew that he could not face this approaching threat alone. Elijah turned from the window, pacing the floor with a measured, deliberate energy. The cabin, humble as it was, offered little in the way of defense. Its wooden walls could do little against bullets or a determined force. He thought back to the stories he had heard in town, tales of Apache warriors, of bandits, of men who would ride for miles to claim what they believed was theirs. Each story had ended with blood and loss. He had always trusted in the peace of the land, but the land, he realized, had no loyalty to any man. Aiyana approached him, stepping softly on the rough wooden floor. She gestured toward the horizon, then tapped the floor near the doorway, suggesting insistently, yet respectfully, that they consider escape or concealment. Elijah understood immediately. Her instincts were sharp-honed through years of survival in a world that had offered her little mercy. He felt a pang of gratitude and awe. In her quiet, unspoken way, she was teaching him about vigilance, about awareness, about the thin line between life and death that stretched across these plains every day. He nodded, acknowledging her warning, and moved toward the small storeroom in the corner. He pulled down what little supplies he had: extra blankets, dried meat water skins, and laid them near the door. "If it comes to that, we'll be ready," he murmured, mostly to himself. Aiyana watched silent, her eyes flicking to him with something that felt almost like approval. The bond between them was growing stronger, each action building trust, each gesture a quiet promise that they would protect each other no matter the cost. Outside, the dust clouds continued to swell. Riders moved in deliberate patterns, some riding alone, others in small groups, their intent clear in the way they scanned the land as they approached. Elijah knew he could not confront them head-on. The cabin offered no advantage, and he was acutely aware that one misstep could result in disaster for both him and Aiyana. Yet turning away, leaving her to the unknown, was unthinkable. He had made a choice, and now he would see it through. Elijah moved to a small shelf near the window and grabbed a rifle, checking the mechanism with careful precision. He wasn't quick on the draw, like some of the younger men in town, but he had learned to shoot with accuracy when it mattered most. Aiyana, meanwhile, positioned herself near the corner, her eyes scanning the horizon, her body language conveying readiness, alertness, and quiet determination. The cabin, once a place of refuge, had transformed into a small fortress of mutual reliance. Time stretched thin. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the broken shutters seemed amplified in the tension of the moment. Elijah's mind raced through possibilities. Would the riders be hostile, seeking conflict, or claiming her for reasons he could not yet fathom? Or were they simply curious, cautious scouts of a larger force? The uncertainty gnawed at him, each passing second, heightening the stakes. He glanced at Aiyana, her dark eyes sharp, scanning, calculating. There was a subtle intelligence in her gaze, a way of reading the land, the wind, the approaching figures that surpassed anything he had seen in many years of solitary survival. He realized that they were not simply waiting for fate to unfold. They were preparing for it, shaping their chances with every small decision. He felt an unfamiliar relief. At least they were not entirely powerless. Suddenly, a movement caught his eye, a single rider breaking away from the rest, moving directly toward the cabin. Elijah's pulse quickened. The rider's intentions were unclear, but the precision of his approach left little room for doubt. He was deliberate, focused. He could be a scout, a messenger, or a harbinger of more immediate danger. Elijah readied himself, rifle in hand, heart pounding in rhythm with the steady thrum of hooves on the hard-packed earth. Aiyana noticed the movement as well. She adjusted her stance, shifting slightly, muscles coiled and ready. Their eyes met briefly, a silent exchange of understanding. Whatever came next, they faced it together. Words were unnecessary. Their trust and connection had transcended the need for speech. Each was attuned to the other's intentions, each aware of the stakes, each willing to act with precision. The rider stopped at the edge of the clearing, dismounting slowly. Dust swirled around him as he approached on foot, hands visible, empty of weapons. Elijah could feel the tension radiating through the small cabin, a pulse of anticipation that seemed to vibrate in the walls. The rider's face was partially obscured by the wide brim of his hat, but his eyes were sharp, observant. Elijah sensed a message, a negotiation yet to begin, carried in every measured step the man took. Aiyana stepped slightly forward, her posture firm yet unthreatening. She did not speak, but her presence conveyed a quiet confidence that complemented Elijah's cautious readiness. The rider's gaze flicked between them, studying the two figures who had claimed the cabin as their own. He lifted a hand in a gesture of acknowledgement, or perhaps warning, and paused, waiting for some signal, some decision that would determine what came next. Elijah's mind raced. He knew the land outside the cabin could not be controlled, could not be tamed yet within these walls. A small measure of influence existed. He could choose to parley, to offer words of peace, or he could prepare for confrontation. Every option carried risk. Every hesitation was costly. And still he felt the weight of his earlier choice pressing upon him. He had fed her, sheltered her, and now he must protect her, no matter the danger that approached. The rider finally spoke, voice low but clear, carrying across the distance inside the cabin. "There's talk of a stranger on this land," he said. "A woman, alone, out here." His eyes lingered on Aiyana, then on Elijah. "We mean no harm, but the plains are dangerous for both of you, and for those who wander alone." Elijah relaxed slightly, though the tension did not fully lift. There was still much he did not know. Who was this rider? Were more behind him? And how would the presence of a young Apache woman on his land alter the fragile balance between the settlers and the tribes of the plains? Aiyana remained silent, but her eyes flicked to the window, noting movement on the horizon that Elijah had not yet seen. Riders far more than he had anticipated were forming lines across the distant hills. Hundreds, perhaps, their shapes etched against the shimmering heat of the midday sun. The scout's warning had only scratched the surface of what was coming. Elijah tightened his grip on the rifle and exchanged a glance with Aiyana. The silent understanding passed between them once more. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Trust, once fragile, had been forged in shared observation and mutual respect. Yet the scale of what awaited beyond the cabin walls was more than either of them could have imagined. The rider, sensing the rising tension, gave a subtle nod before retreating toward the distant dust clouds, leaving Elijah and Aiyana alone once again. But the calm was brief. In the distance, the rhythmic beat of hooves signaled a much larger force advancing hundreds of riders, moving with purpose, the wind carrying the dust of an impending storm. Elijah's mind raced heart-pounding as he realized that their sanctuary had moments, not hours remaining. The plains beyond the cabin stretched wide and merciless, indifferent to the small lives taking refuge within. Elijah and Aiyana prepared themselves aware that the quiet connection they had forged in the past hours would soon be tested in ways neither could yet predict. The world outside waited vast and implacable, ready to challenge every instinct, every decision, every heartbeat. Would they survive the coming storm of riders, and if so, at what cost? The answers lay just beyond the horizon where dust and danger mingled under the relentless sun of the Wild West. The late afternoon sun hung low over the rolling plains, casting long, wavering shadows across Elijah Turner's small ranch. The distant dust clouds had grown a slow-moving storm of figures, etched against the golden horizon. He stood at the edge of the corral, rifle in hand, while Aiyana crouched low near the cabin, her dark eyes scanning every movement with precision. Both understood that the quiet calm they had shared that morning was fleeting. The world outside had begun to press against them, inexorable and unyielding. Elijah's gaze swept the horizon, catching glimpses of riders moving with deliberation, some breaking into small groups, others scanning the land as if mapping it for an approaching force. Their intentions remained unclear, but the weight of numbers was undeniable. One mistake, one careless movement could trigger a confrontation from which there would be no turning back. He turned to Aiyana, who met his eyes with an intensity that belied her youth. She had remained silent since the moment he had offered her food, yet her presence spoke volumes and unspoken strength, a readiness for action. Her instincts, honed through years of surviving on her own, complemented his own hard-earned knowledge of the plains. They had become a team united by circumstance and trust, yet the real test was just beginning. Suddenly, a rider broke from the distant line, moving directly toward the cabin. Elijah's muscles tensed. He signaled to Aiyana, pointing toward the door, and then toward himself. She nodded, slightly understanding immediately. Together they prepared for the first challenge, the test of their ability to act in unison under pressure. The rider approached cautiously, keeping his hands visible. His horse's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust that swirled around his legs as he drew closer. Elijah's voice was steady but firm. "Who's out there?" he called, not lowering the rifle, keeping his stance strong and deliberate. The rider paused, eyes flicking between Elijah and Aiyana. "I mean no harm," he said, voice calm but wary. "There's a woman, alone, out here. Some of us wish to speak to understand the situation before it becomes dangerous." Elijah studied the man for a long moment. His instincts screamed caution, yet the tone was measured, suggesting no immediate threat. He considered his options. Confrontation might provoke the larger group, but hesitation could invite suspicion or worse. Aiyana shifted slightly, her gaze locked on the approaching figure. She subtly adjusted her stance, one foot behind the other, ready to spring if needed. Elijah decided on a measured approach. "Step closer, but no sudden moves," he instructed, keeping his eyes trained on the rider. The man complied, lifting his hand slightly in a gesture of peace, taking careful, deliberate steps. Aiyana mirrored Elijah's composure, her silent readiness, a testament to her adaptability and survival skills. The rider reached the edge of the corral, pausing a few feet from the cabin. "I am a scout," he said, sent to observe. "No harm is intended, but the world outside is not as quiet as it seems. Others will follow, and they do not always come with patience." Elijah's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the distant riders, their presence unmistakable now, hundreds moving with coordination, shadows stretching across the plains like an advancing tide. He realized the first test was not merely this lone scout. It was preparing for the inevitable arrival of the larger force while maintaining control over the immediate encounter. He lowered the rifle slightly, still keeping the man within his sight. "Then you'll need to tell your men to wait. We're not looking for trouble," he said firmly. His voice carried authority, the tone of a man who had lived alone in a land where every decision mattered. Aiyana remained close, body taut with readiness, her eyes flicking between the scout and the horizon. The scout hesitated, clearly weighing the credibility of Elijah's words. He glanced toward the distant riders, then back at the cabin. "I cannot promise they will listen," he said, "but I can relay what I see here." His eyes lingered on Aiyana, acknowledging her presence without questioning it, understanding that she was not simply a passive bystander. Elijah breathed slowly, measuring each heartbeat. He had anticipated this moment, the confrontation, the negotiation, the delicate dance of trust and threat. And yet the tension in the air exceeded anything he had expected. Every decision carried weight. Every hesitation could be exploited. He was acutely aware of the fragile trust that had formed between him and Aiyana, and he refused to let it shatter. Aiyana made a subtle movement, adjusting the small bundle of supplies near the door, preparing for a possible retreat. Her actions were fluid, almost instinctive, reflecting years of survival in a harsh world. Elijah noted her readiness, a silent affirmation that they would face whatever came together. He felt a surge of respect and gratitude. Trust was rare in these plains, yet in her presence he had found it silent, steadfast, and unshakable. Suddenly, a sharp cry broke the tension. A rider from the distant group spurred forward, breaking formation. The scout tensed, signaling with his hands to hold position. Elijah and Aiyana reacted instantly. He raised the rifle while she crouched lower, moving behind the cover of the cabin wall. The rhythm of danger quickened. The plains themselves seemed to pulse with the approach of conflict. The lone rider stopped just short of the cabin, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Hold your fire," he shouted, voice carrying across the short distance. "We are only scouts. No harm will come unless provoked." Elijah's gaze swept across the horizon once more. The distant riders slowed, forming a line along the ridge, watching, waiting. It was a test of patience, of resolve, and of trust. He realized that this was only the first of many trials, the first test of their ability to act decisively under pressure while protecting one another. He lowered the rifle slightly, signaling to Aiyana that they were holding their ground yet remaining fully alert. "We'll wait here," he said, voice low but firm. No sudden moves. The tension hung thick in the air, heavy and electric, as if the entire prairie was holding its breath. The scout nodded, understanding the unspoken command. His gaze lingered on Aiyana once more, a silent acknowledgement of her presence and her strength. Then, with careful steps, he retreated toward the distant ridge, merging back into the larger group that watched from afar. Elijah exhaled slowly, but the relief was fleeting. He knew that the true test had only begun. The larger force loomed beyond the horizon, and their next encounter would be unavoidable. Aiyana relaxed slightly, though her vigilance remained. She moved to the window, scanning the plane's eyes, sharp and calculating. Elijah stood beside her, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing against his shoulders. The first test had been survived, but the stakes had risen. Every moment of calm now carried the shadow of impending danger. Elijah turned to her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. She met his gaze, a silent exchange passing between them. Trust had been earned, but the challenge was far from over. Beyond the horizon, hundreds of riders waited, and the plains would soon demand everything they had to survive. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the cabin. The wind stirred, carrying with it the faint echo of hooves from the ridge. Elijah gripped his rifle tighter, heart pounding. The first test had ended, but the greater trials were only beginning. Who would make the next move, and how would they respond when the storm of riders finally descended upon their quiet sanctuary? The answers lingered just beyond the horizon, waiting for the inevitable clash of wills and survival. The late afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting the plains in a warm, honeyed glow that belied the tension simmering across Elijah Turner's small ranch. The distant riders remained a looming presence, their dust clouds shifting and stretching as they patrolled the rolling hills. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with unspoken questions and the quiet hum of anticipation. Elijah moved carefully about the room, checking the supplies, adjusting the rifle near the door, and glancing repeatedly toward Aiyana. She had settled near the small window, her posture alert yet composed, her dark eyes scanning the horizon with the precision of someone who had grown up reading the land as if it were a book. Elijah could not shake the sense that there was more to her than she had revealed. Her silence, which at first had seemed a mere quirk or perhaps a handicap, now struck him as purposeful, a shield carefully constructed against a world that had shown her little mercy. He had watched her in the morning light, seen the grace and quiet strength in every movement, and he realized that she carried the weight of experience far beyond her years. Her gaze, steady and measured, suggested knowledge of the land of people of dangers that he could only guess at. "What's your story?" he murmured softly, more to himself than to her. Aiyana did not answer. She tilted her head slightly, a subtle gesture that spoke of understanding without words, a gentle acknowledgement that she could not or perhaps would not speak of her past. Elijah respected that. He had learned long ago that trust could not be forced. It must be earned, and sometimes silence was the truest form of communication. As he prepared a small portion of dried meat for her, he noticed the way her hands moved, deliberate, precise, almost ritualistic. Each movement seemed to carry memory. Each glance hinted at lessons learned from hardship and survival. Elijah wondered what had brought her here to this lonely ranch on the edge of the unforgiving plains. The questions hovered unspoken, filling the cabin with a tense curiosity that neither dared to name aloud. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush, dry earth, and faint smoke from a distant campfire. Aiyana's eyes flicked toward the door, then toward the horizon. Elijah followed her gaze, noting the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her hands moved almost imperceptibly, as if readying for action. He realized then that she had experienced things he could not even imagine, things that had honed her instincts and shaped her into a survivor capable of reading the smallest signs of danger. Elijah moved closer, lowering his voice. "You're not alone in this," he said, trying to bridge the gap between them with words, though he knew her silence was not ignorance, but choice. "Whatever's coming, we face it together." Aiyana's eyes softened briefly, a fleeting acknowledgement of trust and perhaps gratitude. She moved slightly closer, keeping herself within reach, yet maintaining the caution of someone who had learned that danger often came disguised as kindness. Elijah understood instinctively she had survived by balancing trust with vigilance, by navigating a world that was as beautiful as it was merciless. He glanced toward the horizon once more. The distant riders continued their deliberate march, their numbers growing more evident as the shadows lengthened. Elijah knew that confrontation was inevitable. The first test, the lone scout who had approached earlier, was only a prelude. Beyond the ridge, hundreds waited, and each step they took carried the weight of unknown intent. He could not predict whether they would be hostile, curious, or something in between, but he knew that Aiyana's presence had already altered the balance. Suddenly, a soft rustle outside drew their attention. A hawk circled high above its cry, sharp against the quiet wind. Aiyana's posture shifted subtly, her eyes narrowing, scanning the distant brush. Elijah followed her gaze, spotting movement among the sage and tumbleweeds. Figures small at first, then growing more distinct, emerged from the folds of the land. Scouts, perhaps allies, perhaps a threat. Elijah felt a familiar tension coil in his chest. He had spent decades navigating the unpredictable plains, understanding that each encounter could turn fatal in an instant. Yet the presence of Aiyana changed the calculus. She was not merely a passive figure in this unfolding drama. She was an active participant, her instincts and knowledge sharpening every decision he made. He had seen glimpses of her skill earlier in the way she handled the rifle, the way she read the land, and he realized with growing respect that she was far more capable than he had first assumed. As they watched, the figures in the distance seemed to pause, almost as if sensing the quiet energy radiating from the cabin. Elijah's mind raced, trying to anticipate their next move. He considered retreat, confrontation, negotiation. All possibilities weighted against the reality that the larger force was not far behind. Every decision had consequences, every hesitation carried risk. Aiyana shifted again, this time moving toward a small bundle of blankets and supplies he had prepared. She adjusted them with careful precision, as though preparing for a long vigil or a sudden move. Elijah understood immediately she was thinking ahead, planning for contingencies that he had only begun to consider. In that moment, he felt a deep sense of gratitude and connection. Trust had been formed, yes, but it was tempered with competence and awareness that gave him confidence amidst the uncertainty. The wind carried faint voices, low and distant, indistinct but unmistakable signs of human presence. Elijah's pulse quickened. The first test had passed, but this was something new, an escalation that demanded both readiness and restraint. He glanced at Aiyana. Her eyes met his, dark and unwavering, and he knew she had sensed the same shift. Together, they had survived the morning. Now they would face the afternoon. Elijah took a deep breath, steadying himself. He moved to the window rifle, ready, scanning the horizon for the first clear sign of intent. Aiyana mirrored his actions, silent but vigilant. The small cabin, once a haven of fragile trust, had become a nexus of strategy, observation, and silent communication. Every glance, every gesture carried meaning. Every heartbeat was measured against the rhythm of the approaching threat. Then, from the ridge, a single figure broke from the line, a rider moving swiftly, deliberately toward the cabin. Elijah felt a familiar coil of tension in his chest. The scout approached, dismounting carefully, hands empty, but eyes sharp. He paused at the edge of the clearing, studying the two figures inside the cabin. Aiyana remained poised, muscles taut, eyes fixed on the movement beyond the glass. Elijah stepped forward, rifle at the ready, voice calm but firm. "Who comes?" he demanded, though his tone was measured, the cadence of someone accustomed to holding the balance between negotiation and threat. The rider lifted a hand slightly, a gesture of peace, and spoke. "I come with words, not violence," he said. "There is a woman here. She is not yours to hide, and yet I see no immediate threat from you. We must speak before others arrive." Elijah's jaw tightened. The true test had begun, the revelation that Aiyana's presence was known, that forces beyond the ridge were already moving, and that the fragile sanctuary of the cabin could be challenged at any moment. He exchanged a brief glance with Aiyana, reading her silent assessment. She was ready, but so was he. The scout took a cautious step back, nodding once before retreating toward the ridge. Elijah exhaled slowly, but the tension did not abate. The distant figures were now clearer, hundreds of riders forming a shadowy line across the hills. Their presence was undeniable, their intent unknown. But one thing was certain: the hidden secrets of Aiyana's past, the truth she had carried silently, would soon come into sharp focus. And when they did, both she and Elijah would be forced to confront dangers and revelations far greater than anything the morning had offered. Aiyana remained silent, eyes fixed on the horizon, and Elijah felt the weight of responsibility settle on him once more. Trust had been earned, yes. But the larger test, the one that would measure courage, compassion, and survival, was yet to come. The plains beyond the cabin stretched wide and indifferent, a landscape of beauty and peril intertwined. And as the shadows lengthened and the riders drew closer, the secrets hidden in Aiyana's past threatened to collide with the relentless realities of the Wild West. Who were these riders, allies, enemies, or something in between? And how would the truth she had kept silent shape the coming confrontation? The answers waited just beyond the horizon, in the heat of the descending sun and the shifting dust clouds that heralded both danger and revelation. Night fell over the vast plains like a dark curtain, swallowing the sun's final glow and leaving the world in muted shades of black and gray. The wind whispered across the dry grass, carrying the distant cries of coyotes and the soft rustle of tumbleweeds. Inside the cabin, Elijah Turner and Aiyana moved with quiet deliberation, their senses heightened by the uncertainty that had stretched across the day. The distant riders had disappeared from sight, but their presence was still palpable, a reminder that the world outside was neither forgiving nor predictable. Elijah stood near the window, rifle in hand, listening. The rhythmic pulse of his own heartbeat seemed unnaturally loud against the nocturnal chorus of the prairie. He had learned long ago that the night on the plains held its own dangers, prowlers, wild animals, and the occasional band of lawless men who thrived under the cover of darkness. Now, with Aiyana by his side, he felt both the weight of responsibility and a growing awareness that he could not anticipate every threat. Aiyana crouched low near the doorway, her eyes scanning the perimeter with a precision that belied her youth. Though she had remained silent for most of the day, her movement spoke volumes, every shift of weight, every careful glance a testament to her survival instincts. Elijah marveled at her skill. She could detect subtle changes in the wind, the faintest sounds across the dry soil, and the approach of danger long before he would notice. As the night deepened, a soft rustle drew their attention. The cabin dogs, usually restless but quiet in the evening, perked up, ears pointed and low growls rumbling in their throats. Elijah tensed, adjusting his grip on the rifle. Aiyana's body mirrored his tension muscles, coiled and ready to spring. They had faced tests before, but the night had a way of magnifying uncertainty, turning shadows into threats and whispers into warnings. From the darkness outside, the rustling grew louder, deliberate, purposeful. Elijah's mind raced through possibilities. It could be a wild animal, hungry and bold, or one of the scouts who had approached earlier, or worse, an advance party from the larger group of riders they had seen in the distance. He signaled to Aiyana, pointing toward the back door and then toward the small loft where additional supplies were kept. She understood immediately, shifting her position to cover the possible exit while keeping herself concealed. Minutes stretched the night air heavy with tension. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the walls seemed amplified. Elijah's pulse thudded in his ears, a relentless reminder that survival required constant vigilance. Aiyana's presence beside him was both comforting and unnerving. She was calm, collected, yet radiated a readiness that reminded him of the precariousness of their situation. Suddenly, a figure moved across the faintly illuminated clearing outside the cabin, a lone shadow against the dim starlight. Elijah raised his rifle, careful to remain unseen, while Aiyana mirrored his movements, eyes fixed on the intruder. The figure paused, scanning the cabin, and then slowly raised a hand. It was a gesture of peace, but the intent behind it remained unclear. Elijah exhaled slowly, keeping his finger near the trigger, but not yet pressing it. "Who's there?" he called, voice low but firm. The figure remained still, then stepped back, melting into the darkness. Elijah lowered the rifle, slightly tension easing just a fraction, but he knew this was only the beginning. The night on the plains was patient, and it had many ways of testing those who dared to live upon it. Hours passed, with only the wind and distant animal calls breaking the oppressive silence. Elijah and Aiyana maintained their vigilance, each movement deliberate, each sound noted. They took turns watching a silent rotation that allowed them both to rest in shifts, while never losing sight of the surrounding danger. In these hours, a deeper bond formed between them, not through words, but through shared awareness and trust. Each glance, each subtle gesture spoke of understanding and reliance. Around midnight, a sudden noise shattered the fragile calm, a branch snapping under weight, followed by the faint sound of hooves brushing against dry earth. Elijah's heart raced, and he raised the rifle instinctively. Aiyana's eyes narrowed, and she moved slightly forward, her body taut with readiness. The intruder or intruders were near, and their presence was deliberate, calculated. Elijah signaled silently to Aiyana, gesturing toward the loft. They both understood if necessary, they could retreat, regroup, and use the higher vantage to observe the threat. But for now, they remained in place, holding their ground, listening, calculating. The night demanded patience, but patience was a test in itself. The rustling grew closer, punctuated by faint whispers carried by the wind. Elijah strained to hear, trying to discern the number of intruders, their movements, their intentions. Aiyana leaned slightly toward him, eyes scanning, fingers poised near the makeshift weapons she had improvised earlier. Every instinct told them that action might be required at any moment, that hesitation could prove fatal. Then, without warning, a figure emerged into the faint moonlight, a man young, wiry, moving with deliberate stealth. He froze at the edge of the clearing, scanning the cabin as if weighing his options. Elijah tensed rifle ready, while Aiyana mirrored his posture, eyes fixed, muscles coiled. The intruder's intent was unclear. He could be a scout, a thief, or a harbinger of a larger threat. The man took a cautious step forward, and Elijah spoke again, voice low and commanding. "Stop where you are. State your purpose." The figure paused, eyes flicking between the cabin and the distant ridge where more shadows hinted at unseen riders. "I mean no harm," he said, voice barely audible over the night wind. "I am alone, scouting, seeking shelter from the night. I saw the lights of your cabin and approached with caution." Elijah's eyes narrowed. He could feel the tension radiating from the man, a mixture of fear and calculated risk. Aiyana shifted slightly, adjusting her stance, and Elijah realized the night had become a test of trust, judgment, and coordination. One wrong move could ignite conflict, but careful observation and measured response could preserve both life and fragile alliances. Minutes stretched as the man remained still, his intent ambiguous. Elijah and Aiyana exchanged a subtle glance, a silent decision to hold their ground while remaining vigilant. The night around them seemed to pulse the wind, carrying the faint scent of dust, sagebrush, and distant smoke. Every shadow seemed alive, every whisper of wind a potential warning. Then from the ridge beyond the clearing, a series of distant cries echoed the unmistakable signal of multiple riders approaching. Dust swirled on the horizon, faint at first, then growing denser with every passing moment. Elijah tightened his grip on the rifle, eyes scanning both the intruder and the distant threat. Aiyana moved slightly forward, ready to act. The night had become a crucible, testing their instincts, trust, and ability to respond under pressure. The lone man at the edge of the clearing finally took a step back, nodding toward the ridge. He turned and vanished into the darkness, leaving Elijah and Aiyana alone once again, but now acutely aware that the greater threat was no longer a shadow. It was a gathering force moving with purpose, closing in with the precision of trained riders. Elijah exhaled slowly, glancing at Aiyana. Their bond, forged through shared observation, unspoken understanding, and the small victories of the day, had been tested and would be tested again. The night stretched ahead long and uncertain, but together they would face whatever came, prepared for the challenges and dangers that lurked in the darkness of the Wild West. Who were the approaching riders, friend or foe? And what would the night reveal about the harsh realities of survival on the plains? The answers waited in the shadows carried on the wind and hidden within the dust clouds that heralded both danger and revelation. The first gray light of dawn crept across the plains, dissolving the shadows that had clung to the land throughout the long night. Elijah Turner stood at the edge of the corral, rifle in hand, every muscle taut with anticipation. The night's threats had faded into memory, but the new day brought its own challenges. Dust swirled on the horizon, a slow-moving tide of movement that signaled the return of the riders, more numerous, more deliberate, and with a purpose that Elijah could sense but not yet name. Aiyana crouched near the cabin doorway, eyes scanning the horizon with the precision of a predator. Though silent, her presence radiated authority and confidence. Every movement she made was deliberate, an unspoken communication with Elijah. They had survived the night together, and now the morning stakes demanded their full attention. The quiet trust that had formed between them was about to be tested again, this time against forces beyond their control. Elijah could see the riders clearly now, their numbers far exceeding the scouts they had seen the previous day. They moved in organized patterns, horses' hooves kicking up plumes of dust that drifted across the plains like spectral banners. The wind carried the faint metallic scent of gunpowder and leather, a warning of the violence that could erupt at any moment. Elijah's grip on his rifle tightened. He had faced threats before, but the scale of this force was daunting. Aiyana's gaze did not waver. She shifted slightly, scanning the patterns of the riders, reading their intent with the same meticulous focus that had saved them during the night. Elijah marveled at her skill. She was more than a survivor. She was a strategist, anticipating movements and preparing for contingencies with an instinctive understanding of the land and its perils. He felt both awe and a deep sense of reliance on her abilities. The rider's approach was deliberate, almost ceremonial in its precision. Elijah realized that negotiation or confrontation would not be simple. Their intentions were unknown, and their numbers alone were enough to overwhelm him if miscalculated. He glanced at Aiyana, whose eyes met his with an unspoken question. How would they face this? The answer was clear. They would act together, each aware of the other's strengths and instincts. Elijah moved toward the cabin, speaking quietly. "We need to stay calm. Watch for patterns, look for signs. They may be testing us." Aiyana's response was a slight nod, her body language conveying understanding and readiness. She adjusted her position, crouching near the window that offered a clear view of the approaching riders, while remaining partially concealed behind the rough wooden beams. As the dust clouds drew nearer, Elijah could make out the faces of some of the riders. They were stern-focused and disciplined, their expressions betraying neither malice nor friendliness. Each man seemed aware of the stakes moving in unison, a force shaped by experience and purpose. The sight was both intimidating and hypnotic, a reminder of how small and vulnerable a single cabin could be on these vast plains. Elijah and Aiyana watched as the riders formed a loose semicircle around the property, stopping at calculated distances. Their horses pawed at the earth, impatient yet controlled, waiting for a signal or command. Elijah's mind raced. He knew they could not remain idle, but any action had to be deliberate, precise, and coordinated. Aiyana shifted slightly, indicating with a subtle gesture that she had noticed a break in the riders' formation, a small opportunity that could be exploited if approached carefully. Elijah considered the terrain. The cabin offered little cover, but the corral walls and the rough fence lines could serve as temporary barriers, and the sparse sagebrush provided minimal concealment. He estimated the distance to the nearest rider, calculating the timing needed to act if aggression escalated. Every movement had to be controlled. Any sign of panic could invite disaster. Suddenly, a rider detached from the main group, moving closer to the cabin at a slow trot. Elijah tensed, rifle raised, while Aiyana's eyes followed the approach, analyzing every detail. The man stopped at a safe distance, hands raised slightly, and surveyed the cabin with a careful, deliberate gaze. His posture suggested caution, but also a readiness to respond if provoked. Elijah stepped forward, voice steady but firm. "State your business," he called. "Who are you, and why do you ride here?" The rider's eyes flicked to Aiyana, acknowledging her presence without a hint of hostility. "I am a messenger," he replied. "We mean no harm if you mean none. But the plains are unforgiving, and those who wander alone or harbor strangers must be cautious." Aiyana's eyes never left the man. Her body language was a mixture of readiness and assessment, as though she were weighing the truth of his words against the unknown intentions of the larger group. Elijah realized again how crucial her instincts were. Without her insight, he might have misjudged the situation entirely. He felt a deep respect coupled with the realization that their survival depended on both his decisions and her vigilance. The rider's words hung in the air, but before Elijah could respond, a distant shout echoed across the ridge, a signal sharp and deliberate that reverberated through the plains. The larger group of riders began to shift their coordinated movements, suggesting a readiness to advance. Elijah felt a tightening in his chest. The test was no longer just observation. It was a countdown to confrontation. He glanced at Aiyana. Her dark eyes met his unflinching, conveying the same resolve he felt coursing through his own veins. They had faced challenges together before, but this was different. The stakes were higher, the danger more immediate, and the consequences of any mistake far greater. He realized that they had been preparing for this moment, unknowingly honing their trust and coordination in the quiet hours of dawn and the tense night before. Elijah lowered his rifle slightly, signaling to Aiyana that they would wait and observe a moment longer. The rider at the front remained still, then turned to the distant group, raising a hand in a subtle gesture that seemed to communicate instruction or warning. The larger force paused, creating a brief lull in their movement, a momentary window that Elijah and Aiyana could exploit if needed. He whispered to Aiyana, careful not to be overheard. "Watch their patterns. Look for gaps, opportunities. We may need to act quickly, but only if necessary." She responded with a subtle tilt of the head, her posture relaxed, yet poised, ready to execute any plan without hesitation. The dust rose again on the horizon, signaling renewed movement. Riders adjusted their positions, forming tighter lines, their coordination a silent reminder of the power they represented. Elijah's pulse quickened. The first test had been survived, but the morning's challenge, the rising stakes of numbers coordination and unknown intent, was far from over. Suddenly, a horse reared at the edge of the semicircle, its rider struggling to maintain control. The momentary chaos drew a flicker of tension through the line, a crack in the disciplined formation. Elijah and Aiyana exchanged a glance, recognizing the subtle opportunity that had presented itself. Their trust, coordination, and instincts had prepared them to exploit such moments. Yet before they could act, the rider regained control, and the line reformed a seamless display of discipline and precision. The window for action had closed, reminding them that the forces beyond the cabin were vigilant, capable, and relentless. Elijah tightened his grip on the rifle Aiyana, adjusting her stance. The rising stakes of the morning were clear patience, precision, and trust would determine their survival in the moments to come. The plains themselves seemed to hold their breath, the wind still, the dust hanging in the early light, as Elijah and Aiyana prepared for the inevitable escalation. Every heartbeat, every glance, every breath was measured a silent rhythm of readiness. The first true confrontation was approaching, and the stakes had never been higher. Who would make the next move, and how would Elijah and Aiyana respond when the full force of the riders arrived? The answers waited just beyond the horizon in the shimmering heat and swirling dust of the relentless Wild West. The sun had risen high, casting sharp light over the endless expanse of the plains, yet for Elijah Turner, the brightness offered no comfort. The calm of the morning was deceptive. Beyond the cabin walls, the dust clouds of hundreds of riders stretched across the horizon, their presence a looming reminder of the dangers of the Wild West. Each silhouette carried intent, yet Elijah could not discern whether it was hostile, neutral, or something in between. And in that uncertainty lay the moral dilemma he faced: to act, to wait, or to retreat. Inside the cabin, Aiyana sat quietly near the corner, her dark eyes fixed on the distant horizon. Elijah watched her, marveling at the calm precision of her movements. She had survived the harshest conditions, honed instincts sharper than any blade, yet now even she was constrained by the enormity of the challenge before them. He realized that survival here would require more than courage. It would demand ethical choices, decisions that weighed the lives of many against the lives of a few. Elijah's mind raced through possibilities. Could he risk confronting the approaching riders? What if they misunderstood his intentions? could a misstep lead to bloodshed, and yet turning away, abandoning Aiyana to her fate was unthinkable. He had offered her shelter, food, and protection. To fail now would be a betrayal of everything that had brought them together. He turned to Aiyana, speaking softly as though the walls themselves could overhear. "We can't just wait. We need to think carefully. Every move has consequences." She nodded, acknowledging the truth of his words without speaking. Her silence had become their shared language, a dialogue of glances, gestures, and unspoken understanding. They had survived together before, and now their choices would test not only their skills, but their moral fortitude. Elijah considered the terrain outside. The cabin provided some cover, but only temporary. The open plains offered little advantage, and the vast numbers of riders meant that any attempt to flee could end disastrously. Negotiation seemed risky, yet perhaps unavoidable. He had to balance his desire to protect Aiyana with the knowledge that rash action could escalate into violence. Every decision weighed heavily, and he felt the full gravity of responsibility pressing on him. He glanced at Aiyana again, noticing the subtle signs of her thought process, the way she adjusted her posture, her keen observation of the approaching force, the quiet calculation of risk. She had already begun to assess options, weighing potential consequences and opportunities. Elijah felt a surge of respect. He had underestimated her. She was not just a survivor, she was a strategist, capable of guiding them through moral and practical peril with clarity he could only aspire to match. The riders on the horizon were moving closer, their formation deliberate, almost ceremonial in precision. Elijah realized that any confrontation would not be impulsive. It would be calculated, a test of wit, courage, and judgment. He considered their alternatives: parley retreat or risk standoff. Each choice carried moral weight. To fight could mean unnecessary bloodshed. To flee could mean abandoning the woman he had promised to protect. To do nothing was not an option. He spoke quietly to Aiyana, outlining his thoughts. "We have three options: wait and risk misinterpretation, retreat, and possibly provoke pursuit, or show our intent to negotiate. Each has its dangers." She listened intently, her eyes dark and unwavering. Then with a subtle nod she gestured toward the door, then toward the horizon, a silent suggestion that they might attempt to communicate to bridge the gap between fear and understanding. Elijah exhaled slowly. It was the hardest decision he had faced in years. He had lived alone on these plains, making choices of survival and necessity, but now the stakes were not only his life, but hers as well. He knew that courage alone would not suffice. Clarity, restraint, and moral insight were equally vital. He stepped toward the door, rifle still in hand, but lowered slightly, a gesture of measured openness rather than aggression. "We need to show them we mean no harm," he said softly, more to himself than to Aiyana. "But we must remain vigilant. One false move, one misread signal, and it could all end in violence." Aiyana adjusted her stance, mirroring his intentions, ready to react, yet poised to maintain peace. The dust clouds on the horizon continued to swell. Riders broke from the main formation, approaching in small, deliberate groups. Elijah noted their spacing, their posture, and the subtle cues that revealed intent. Some seemed cautious, others curious, but all were attentive. The moral calculus became even more acute. If they misrepresented themselves, even inadvertently, it could provoke retaliation. If they acted with restraint, they might avoid unnecessary bloodshed, but the risk of misinterpretation lingered. Elijah glanced at Aiyana again. Her gaze was fixed, calculating, her hands poised near the rifle and dagger she had carried since the first day he had found her. Her instincts were unerring, and he trusted her judgment implicitly. Together they would need to navigate not only physical danger, but the ethical complexities of the situation, protecting themselves without inviting harm, showing compassion without weakness, and asserting agency without provoking hostility. The nearest rider stopped at the edge of the clearing, dismounting slowly. Elijah raised his hand in a gesture of measured caution, and Aiyana mirrored the action. The rider's gaze swept the cabin, noting both occupants, then shifted toward the ridge where more riders waited. He lifted his voice low, but carrying, "We come as scouts. We wish only to understand. Any threat is unintentional. We mean no harm." Elijah weighed his options. A direct response could calm the situation or escalate it. Retreat might signal weakness, yet waiting too long could provoke suspicion. Finally, he spoke, voice steady and authoritative. "We have no quarrel. We seek only to protect ourselves and those under our care. Approach cautiously and no one will be harmed." Aiyana's eyes flicked to him, a subtle affirmation of trust. They had navigated the first moral hurdle, establishing intention and credibility in the face of an ambiguous threat. Yet the larger question remained, would the approaching force accept their words, or would the vast numbers of riders override reason with aggression? The riders on the ridge seemed to pause, a tense stillness settling over the plains. Elijah's muscles were taut with anticipation, every nerve alert. Aiyana crouched, her eyes scanning the landscape, aware that any moment could demand immediate action. The moral dilemmas of survival, protection, and communication hung in the air, as heavy as the dust-laden wind sweeping across the prairie. Then a signal from the ridge, a cry, a movement, a command cut through the morning calm. The riders began to advance in tighter formation, their intent clearer now. They were moving with purpose, testing the boundaries of the cabin, assessing the courage and strategy of those within. Elijah and Aiyana exchanged a glance, silent but loaded with understanding. The first moral test had been survived. The next challenge would demand both courage and judgment under pressure. The plane seemed to hold its breath, the wind still, as Elijah adjusted his grip on the rifle. Every moment, every decision carried weight. To act rashly could mean disaster. To hesitate could invite catastrophe. The moral dilemmas of the Wild West were never abstract. They were immediate, visceral, and inescapable. And now, with the full force of human intent approaching, Elijah and Aiyana would face a trial that would test not only their survival instincts, but their capacity for judgment, trust, and ethical action. Who would make the first move, and how would their choices shape the outcome for both themselves and the approaching riders? The answers waited just beyond the horizon, where dust and sunlight mingled in a silent promise of confrontation, revelation, and the ultimate test of courage and conscience. The sun climbed higher, baking the plains in a harsh, relentless light. Elijah Turner stood at the edge of the cabin porch, rifle in hand, every sense alert to the approaching riders. The morning's moral dilemmas had passed into tense anticipation, but now the situation had shifted. The first signs of active conflict were emerging. Dust clouds swirled on the horizon, hundreds of riders moving with purpose, their intent unmistakable. They were close enough now that individual figures became discernible, faces set with determination, hands gripping reins and weapons alike. Aiyana crouched near the corner of the cabin, eyes sharp, scanning for any sign of weakness in the riders' formation. Her silence had become a language of its own, every movement a communication of readiness, vigilance, and precision. Elijah watched her, marveling at the way she read the land, the people, and the situation simultaneously. Her instincts were flawless. Her calm, controlled presence provided a counterbalance to the storm of tension rising outside. Elijah knew that negotiation was their only hope to avoid bloodshed. The riders were numerous, disciplined, and deliberate. Any rash action on his part could provoke a massacre, yet doing nothing was equally dangerous. He had offered sanctuary to Aiyana, and he could not abandon her now. His eyes swept the horizon, analyzing the spacing movements and intent of the approaching group. There was no room for error. From the edge of the ridge, a rider broke from the main line, moving closer to the cabin in a deliberate approach. Elijah raised his rifle, keeping it leveled, but not aimed directly at the man, signaling a cautious openness. Aiyana mirrored his stance, crouched, yet ready, eyes tracking every detail. The rider dismounted at a measured distance, hands raised in a gesture of peace, though his body remained taut, ready to react to any sudden movement. "I am a messenger," the rider called, voice clear over the wind. "We seek only understanding. No harm is intended, but our force is large and caution is required." Elijah's jaw tightened. The rider's words were a test, but the presence of the larger group was a silent threat. They were being observed, measured, and judged before the first true action could occur. Elijah stepped slightly forward, lowering the rifle as a gesture of trust without revealing vulnerability. "We have no quarrel," he said firmly. "We seek only safety and peace. Anyone who approaches with hostile intent will be met with resistance. Those who respect our space will find no reason for conflict." The rider paused, glancing toward the distant ridge, then back at Elijah. His eyes briefly flicked toward Aiyana, acknowledging her presence without question, and understanding that she was not a passive figure, but an equal in readiness and capability. He nodded once and raised his hand in acknowledgement, then stepped back slightly, awaiting further instruction. Elijah exhaled, but his relief was temporary. The larger group of riders on the horizon had begun to adjust their formation, moving in tighter, coordinated lines. Horses pawed at the earth, snorting and shifting, the sound echoing across the plains. The approaching force was no longer merely a distant presence. It had become an active, immediate pressure against the cabin and its occupants. Aiyana moved slightly, adjusting the small bundle of supplies near the door, preparing for contingencies. Her movements were fluid, instinctive, and precise. Elijah realized again how crucial her presence was, not only as a partner in survival, but as a strategist whose instincts could tip the balance between confrontation and compromise. He felt gratitude and a deep sense of reliance. Together, they formed a unit capable of navigating the rising tension with skill and discretion. From the ridge, another rider broke away, moving toward the cabin in a deliberate arc. Elijah observed the motion, noting the calculated approach. This was no random action. It was reconnaissance, a probe to test their intentions and readiness. He signaled subtly to Aiyana, and she adjusted her stance, moving to a position that allowed her to cover both the approaching figure and the horizon beyond. Their silent coordination was seamless, a product of shared experience, trust, and mutual understanding. The rider stopped a short distance from the cabin, dismounting carefully. His eyes swept over Elijah, then Aiyana, then the small structure itself. He raised his hand slightly, maintaining a posture that suggested non-aggression, but the tension in his body betrayed his readiness to act if provoked. Elijah kept his rifle leveled, though his finger hovered above the trigger only in case of necessity. "We do not wish for conflict," the rider said, voice calm but carrying authority. "But our group needs assurance. Any act of aggression could force a reaction we would rather avoid." Elijah nodded slowly. His instincts told him that the riders were testing measuring, and that a single misstep could spark a chain of events spiraling beyond control. He took a careful step forward. "We mean no harm," he said, keeping his tone firm yet respectful. "We will not act against you unless provoked. You may pass and observe as you wish, but stay at a distance. Our priority is to protect ourselves and those under our care." The rider's eyes lingered on Aiyana. He recognized her presence and her silent command over her own safety, a reflection of skill and resilience that demanded respect. He gave a subtle nod, then gestured toward the ridge, where more riders awaited. Elijah understood immediately. This was a signal to the main force, a test of compliance, a silent negotiation unfolding without words. The distant riders shifted, forming a line that spanned the ridge like a shadow across the plains. Their approach was deliberate, but they maintained a cautious distance, as if acknowledging Elijah's words while assessing the cabin's occupants. Dust swirled around their horses, creating a shimmering haze that magnified the tension, the plains itself seeming to hold its breath. Elijah glanced at Aiyana. Her eyes met his, steady and unwavering. No words were needed. They had faced threats before, but this was different. The scale, the numbers, the uncertainty all demanded absolute coordination. Each movement had to be deliberate, each glance a calculation. Together they would navigate the first direct approach of the riders, balancing courage, strategy, and restraint. Then a subtle movement from the ridge, one rider breaking from the line, trotting slightly faster, hinted at a potential misstep or a test. Elijah and Aiyana adjusted instantly. He raised his rifle with measured intent while she shifted position, eyes narrowed, muscles coiled. The moment was suspended, the plains waiting to see which side would make the first decisive move. The first rider reached the edge of the clearing and paused, his gaze sweeping from cabin to horizon. Elijah's pulse quickened. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing upon him. Any decision now could escalate into violence or avert it entirely. He exhaled slowly, measuring each heartbeat, each breath, preparing for the inevitable test that was about to unfold. And then, from the distant line on the ridge, a horn sounded low, commanding and unmistakable. The riders' formation shifted, a collective ripple of motion indicating readiness. Elijah glanced at Aiyana. Her dark eyes met his unwavering, conveying the same unspoken resolve they would face the approaching force together, ready to act decisively to protect, to survive, and to navigate the fine line between confrontation and diplomacy. The plains, golden and endless, held their breath, dust swirling in the sunlight. The first direct confrontation had begun, and Elijah knew that the coming moments would define not only their survival, but the fragile bond of trust they had forged amidst the vast, unforgiving Wild West. Who would make the next move, and what would the riders decide upon seeing the occupants' calm readiness? The answers waited on the horizon in the shimmering heat, and swirling dust that presaged both danger and revelation. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon, turning the vast plains into a sea of gold and shadow. Elijah Turner's eyes remained fixed on the distant riders, hundreds of figures stretching across the hills, their movements deliberate and coordinated. Every instinct in his body told him that the time for measured observation was ending. The first signs of confrontation had emerged, and the probability of survival required immediate action. He turned to Aiyana, who crouched near the cabin doorway, eyes dark and unwavering, scanning the approaching line of riders with the precision of a seasoned strategist. Their silent understanding was complete. The morning's conflicts had taught them to anticipate movement, to read intention, and to act with deliberate timing. Now the challenge was to withdraw without provoking unnecessary violence, to retreat strategically while maintaining the advantage that the cabin and surrounding terrain offered. Elijah moved swiftly to the back of the cabin, gathering blankets, dried meat, and water skins, assessing their portable supplies. "We'll need to move to higher ground," he said quietly, careful not to alarm Aiyana. "From there, we can observe and plan. If they come closer, we'll have the advantage." She nodded, her body already poised for action, understanding without words the plan he outlined. The unspoken communication between them had become seamless, a language forged in trust, observation, and necessity. The terrain beyond the cabin offered limited but valuable options. A small ridge not far from the corral, dotted with sagebrush and uneven rock formations, provided both concealment and a vantage point. It was not ideal, but it was enough. Elijah knew that if they moved quickly and quietly, they could establish a temporary stronghold while buying time to evaluate the intentions of the approaching riders. As they prepared to move, a rider broke from the formation on the ridge, moving closer to their cabin with cautious steps. Elijah tensed, rifle in hand, while Aiyana adjusted her stance. The figure's eyes scanned the cabin before lifting a hand in a subtle gesture of peace. Elijah exhaled slowly, signaling to Aiyana that no immediate confrontation was necessary, yet maintaining alertness. They stepped into the open, moving with precision across the short distance from the cabin to the first cover of scattered rocks and brush. Every step was deliberate. Every movement minimized sound. Aiyana led subtly, her eyes flicking to the horizon, assessing the distance and coordination of the riders. Elijah followed, relying on both his knowledge of the land and her intuitive guidance. The strategic retreat was underway. The riders on the ridge adjusted their positions in response, moving in tighter lines, eyes scanning for the pair's trajectory. Elijah and Aiyana reached the first cover point and paused, catching their breath, surveying the situation. From this vantage, they could see more of the riders, the scale of the force now clear. Hundreds of mounted figures stretched across the plains, a silent, disciplined tide, moving with intent. Each rider was positioned to maintain surveillance, yet none advanced recklessly, suggesting that they were testing, waiting for a reaction. Elijah glanced at Aiyana. Her dark eyes reflected calm determination. She gestured toward a higher rock formation ahead, subtly indicating a secondary position where they could gain a better line of sight and remain partially concealed. He nodded in agreement, signaling readiness to continue. Their retreat was not mere withdrawal. It was a tactical maneuver designed to preserve advantage while navigating the risk of immediate engagement. The wind shifted, carrying faint scents of leather, horse sweat, and dust. The riders adjusted, responding to the subtleties of the land and the movement of their quarry. Elijah could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes assessing him, evaluating the threat, calculating the outcome. He realized that the strategic retreat was more than a physical maneuver. It was a psychological test, a demonstration of composure, awareness, and control under pressure. They reached the higher ground, settling behind the largest boulders with a clear view of the ridge and the cabin below. From this vantage, they could see every movement of the approaching riders, every subtle shift in formation, and every signal that might indicate intent. Elijah exhaled, gripping his rifle tightly, aware that the battle was far from over. The first test of retreat had succeeded, but the next challenge would require courage, timing, and the ability to anticipate the riders' actions. Aiyana moved to a narrow slit between rocks, her eyes scanning, hands poised for action if necessary. Elijah followed her example, realizing that their survival depended on remaining calm and deliberate. Each glance they exchanged communicated understanding and coordination. Trust honed over the past 2 days was now their most valuable weapon. From the ridge, a figure stepped forward, distinct against the morning sun. It was one of the riders who had approached the cabin earlier. Urshi. He raised a hand and called out, his voice carrying over the wind. "We do not wish to fight. We seek only understanding. Remain calm and we may avoid bloodshed." Elijah's jaw tightened. The words were cautious, diplomatic, yet they revealed the tension in the air the riders were testing, probing, evaluating whether force or negotiation would be required. Elijah signaled to Aiyana. "Hold position," he whispered. "Watch their movements. Do not engage unless necessary." She nodded, muscles taut and ready. They had survived the first confrontations by remaining calm, coordinated, and strategic. Now the retreat had placed them in a position to observe, anticipate, and act with precision. The higher ground offered advantage, but it also demanded patience. Every movement, every choice could tip the balance. The riders began a slow, deliberate advance, maintaining formation, but spreading to cover the approaches from which Elijah and Aiyana had moved. Dust swirled in their wake, highlighting the meticulous coordination of hundreds of horses and riders. Elijah's pulse quickened. The scale of the approaching force was daunting, yet he found reassurance in Aiyana's presence. Her silent assessment of the situation mirrored his own, and together they formed a unified front. Minutes passed like hours. The ridge remained tense, the air thick with anticipation. Then a faint signal, a horn, distant yet unmistakable, echoed across the plains. The riders adjusted formation again, signaling preparation for the next phase of their approach. Elijah exhaled slowly. The strategic retreat had succeeded in buying them time, but the larger challenge was imminent. He glanced at Aiyana. Her dark eyes met his unwavering, filled with the same resolve and awareness that had guided them through every previous test. The retreat had been tactical, but now the true challenge awaited, facing a force vastly larger and more coordinated than any they had previously encountered, while maintaining trust, composure, and strategic advantage. The plains stretched endlessly before them, golden and merciless, as the riders moved steadily closer. Elijah tightened his grip on the rifle muscles, coiled senses alert. The strategic retreat had been executed flawlessly, but the coming engagement would demand every ounce of skill, courage, and coordination they possessed. And as the first true signs of the riders' advance appeared in the early morning light, Elijah and Aiyana knew that the next moments would determine not only their survival, but the fragile bond that had been forged through trust, observation, and shared adversity. Who would make the next move? And would the retreat have secured them enough advantage to withstand the approaching tide of mounted riders? The answers waited on the horizon in the heat, dust, and tension of the relentless Wild West. The first pink streaks of dawn stretched across the horizon, illuminating the endless plains with a fragile light that belied the storm approaching. Elijah Turner crouched behind a large boulder rifle in hand, eyes scanning the distant ridge where hundreds of mounted figures now moved with terrifying coordination. Aiyana crouched beside him, mirrored his vigilance, her dark eyes scanning the terrain for any sign of weakness or opportunity. The quiet tension of the previous night and morning had escalated into an imminent confrontation. The full force of the riders was upon them. The dust from the approaching herd swirled into spirals carried by the gentle morning breeze, but each swirl contained the unmistakable rhythm of countless hooves. Elijah could now see the riders in sharp detail, disciplined, armed, and unflinching, their expressions steely and unreadable. He estimated their number, hundreds, perhaps 500, stretching across the undulating hills, a living wave of power advancing toward the cabin. Aiyana shifted slightly, motioning for Elijah to follow her to a more advantageous position. Together they moved swiftly and silently across the sparse sagebrush toward a higher mound of earth that offered partial cover and a better vantage of the encroaching force. Each step was deliberate, every movement carefully measured to avoid attracting attention. The stakes had never been higher, and both understood that their survival depended on precise coordination and timing. Elijah exhaled slowly, trying to steady the pounding of his heart. The air carried the mingled scents of dust, horse sweat, and leather, a sensory reminder of the disciplined power gathering before them. He glanced at Aiyana. Her dark eyes remained fixed on the approaching riders, reflecting focus and calm, a mirror of his own resolve. He drew a deep breath, reminding himself that fear could not dictate their actions. Strategy, trust, and anticipation were their only weapons now. From the ridge, the leading riders broke from formation, moving deliberately toward the cabin, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust that shimmered in the dawn light. Elijah and Aiyana tensed, ready to react. The first interaction would determine the tone of the day. A misstep could ignite violence. A careful approach could buy time. Every instinct told them to wait, observe, and respond with precision. The riders paused at a calculated distance from the cabin, dismounting in measured motions. Their eyes swept over the cabin and the ridge, noting the positions of Elijah and Aiyana. Their leader, taller and older than the others, spoke first, his voice carrying across the still morning air. "We know who is here. We know who has taken refuge. We do not wish for unnecessary bloodshed, but our presence must be acknowledged." Elijah stepped slightly forward, keeping his rifle leveled, but not aimed directly at the approaching figures. "We do not wish for conflict," he replied, voice steady. "We protect ourselves and those under our care. We will not act aggressively unless provoked. You have my word." Aiyana's eyes flicked to him briefly, a subtle gesture of reassurance. Together they projected calm confidence, while maintaining readiness. The rider's leader studied Elijah, then glanced toward the horizon. From the ridge, additional riders emerged, hundreds more, stretching across the plains in a disciplined arc. Dust clouds rose like waves, signaling their advance. The scale of the force was overwhelming, yet there was no chaos, only disciplined, deliberate movement. Elijah felt a tightening in his chest, but forced himself to remain composed. Aiyana moved to a small gap in the rocks, positioning herself to observe any shift in the riders' formation. Elijah followed her lead, understanding that they were now in a standoff, a delicate balance between diplomacy and defense. Any misstep, any sudden movement, could escalate the situation into violence. Their strategic retreat had bought them time, but the full confrontation had arrived. The riders signaled to each other with subtle gestures, horse reins flicking, and bodies shifting. Elijah observed carefully, noting the precision and coordination. It was clear that the force was not chaotic, but organized, disciplined, and ready. The morning air seemed to pulse with anticipation, the tension so thick that even the wind appeared to hold its breath. Then from the center of the formation, the leader raised his voice again. "We know she is not of your tribe. We have come to ensure her safety and to speak with you. Harm her, and you will face consequences beyond your comprehension. Show us that your intentions are honorable." Elijah understood immediately the riders were testing their resolve, gauging their morality and courage before the first action. The moral dilemmas of the past hours now crystallized into a tangible threat, the test of action versus restraint, protection versus provocation. He met Aiyana's gaze. She nodded subtly, acknowledging the gravity of the moment. Together they would navigate the tension, balancing assertiveness with caution. The riders advanced slightly, maintaining formation, but closing the distance in a controlled, deliberate manner. But Elijah's pulse quickened, yet he remained composed, relying on both his instincts and Aiyana's insight. They were not merely defending themselves, they were negotiating survival, asserting agency, and conveying the integrity of their intentions without speaking more than necessary. Aiyana's eyes flicked to a distant rise where additional riders could be seen moving in from another direction. Elijah followed her gaze, realizing that the encirclement was near completion. The strategic retreat had positioned them advantageously, but now they faced the full scale of the force, hundreds of riders converging with intent, the plains alive with movement, dust, and tension. Elijah drew a deep breath, keeping the rifle ready, but lowering it slightly as a signal of measured restraint. "We mean no harm," he called, voice firm yet respectful. "We protect ourselves and we honor those who seek peace. Let no misunderstanding bring unnecessary violence." The leader of the riders raised a hand, signaling a pause. The formation shifted slightly, a ripple of motion across the mounted figures as they assessed his words. Elijah felt the tension coiling tighter in his chest. Every moment was a test, every glance a negotiation. The dawn had transformed into a crucible, one in which courage, strategy, and integrity would determine survival. Aiyana moved slightly forward, hands poised near the small dagger she had kept hidden, her eyes tracking the subtle cues in the rider's movements. Elijah mirrored her readiness, muscles coiled, senses alert. They were a unit, a pair bound by trust, observation, and shared survival, facing a force that threatened to overwhelm them, yet paused to gauge their response. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the plains. Dust clouds swirled around the horses, and the quiet hum of anticipation hung in the air. The riders waited. Elijah and Aiyana held their ground, and the plains themselves seemed to watch, waiting to see which side would make the first decisive move. And then a distant horn sounded, a low, commanding note that reverberated across the ridge. The riders stiffened, adjusting positions and signaling readiness. Elijah and Aiyana exchanged a brief glance. silent communication passing between them. The test of restraint, strategy, and courage was about to escalate into action. The siege had begun, and the coming moments would determine not only their survival, but the fragile balance of trust, honor, and human intent on the unforgiving Wild West plains. Who would act first, and what would the consequences be when the full force of the riders descended upon their small sanctuary? The answers waited just beyond the horizon, carried in the dust, the hooves, and the rising tension of dawn. The sun had risen fully now, washing the plains in brilliant light, but it brought little comfort. Elijah Turner crouched behind the ridge rifle at the ready, eyes fixed on the encircling riders below. Aiyana mirrored his stance, silent and vigilant, her body coiled like a spring, ready to react at a moment's notice. The siege that had begun at dawn had reached a tense plateau. Hundreds of mounted figures surrounded the cabin below, disciplined and alert, yet no one had made the first aggressive move. The balance of power hung by a thread. Elijah knew that the next step was crucial. Force would provoke disaster. Hesitation might signal weakness. He took a steadying breath, recalling the lessons of the past days, the nights of silent observation, the hours of careful retreat, the subtle signals that had kept them alive. Now they faced the ultimate test: communication. They had to convey intent, establish understanding, and navigate the delicate psychology of a force far larger than themselves. He looked at Aiyana. Her dark eyes met his, full of quiet determination. She gestured toward the center of the encircling riders, a subtle signal that their focus should be on the apparent leader, a man riding slightly apart from the main line, taller and more imposing than the rest, with a measured authority that radiated over the assembled group. Elijah recognized him from the dusted outline of the ridge earlier. Makia, the chief. Elijah's jaw tightened. Approaching the leader would be risky, yet it was their only option to prevent bloodshed. Any misstep could spark violence, yet remaining hidden would do little to assuage the mounting tension. He lowered his rifle slightly, a gesture of intent signaling to Aiyana that they would attempt communication. She nodded subtly, her posture unchanging, eyes alert, body ready for instant reaction. Together they descended carefully toward a clearing halfway between the ridge and the encircling riders, a neutral ground that offered partial cover and visibility. Makia noticed the movement immediately. The riders shifted slightly, forming a semicircle to maintain discipline and protect their chief, yet they did not advance aggressively. Elijah and Aiyana stopped at a respectful distance. He raised one hand, slowly palm outward, and spoke clearly, voice carrying over the still morning air. "We do not wish for conflict. We seek only to protect ourselves and those under our care. No one need be harmed if intentions remain honorable." Makia's eyes, sharp and piercing, studied them carefully. He gestured to a few of his men who remained still but vigilant, then raised his hand toward Elijah and Aiyana. "Approach cautiously," he said, voice deep and resonant. "Our intent is to speak, not fight, but any sudden or threatening action will be met with force." Elijah glanced at Aiyana. She exhaled softly, nodding imperceptibly. Together they stepped forward, each movement deliberate, measured. The distance closed with careful precision, neither side breaking the fragile rhythm of observation and restraint. Dust swirled in the rising sun, golden particles catching the light, as if the plains themselves were holding their breath. Makia extended one hand, slightly signaling a pause. "We know why she is here," he said, his gaze flicking to Aiyana. "But there are questions that must be answered. Who protects her? What is her place on these lands? Why has she been sheltered by outsiders?" Elijah swallowed. The questions were heavy with implication. He lowered the rifle, fully speaking with honesty and measured respect. "I found her alone, injured and starving. I offered what shelter and care I could. I acted out of compassion, not conquest. She is under my protection, but I intend no harm to your people." Aiyana stepped slightly forward, her gaze steady. She did not speak, yet her presence communicated resolve, dignity, and trustworthiness. Makia's eyes flicked toward her, noting her composure, the strength underlying her silence. He seemed to weigh the visual testimony of her demeanor against the words of Elijah, assessing truth not only by speech, but by presence, posture, and intent. The surrounding riders shifted subtly, as if the tension in the air had thickened. Elijah's mind raced, aware that any misstep could unravel the delicate negotiation. He met Makia's gaze, directly willing him to understand that their intentions were genuine. Aiyana's silent strength bolstered his confidence. Together, they projected unity, clarity, and moral integrity. After a long moment, Makya's expression softened slightly. "She is our own," he said, voice calm but firm. "She belongs to her people, yet you have acted with restraint and care, not with cruelty. That must be acknowledged." Elijah nodded, grateful for the recognition, but aware that the situation remained precarious. Hundreds of riders still surrounded them, their silent presence a reminder that trust was tentative and contingent. Elijah spoke again. "I understand. I seek only peace. I will protect her as long as I can, and I will respect the customs and boundaries of your people." Makya's gaze lingered, scanning the terrain, the cabin behind Elijah, and the coiled posture of Aiyana beside him. Then, after a long pause, he signaled a subtle relaxation among his men. "You have shown courage and restraint," Makya said finally. "But this does not erase the past, nor guarantee safety. Actions speak louder than words. Continue to act with honor, and you may yet preserve life." The line of riders subtly shifted, some stepping back, creating a wider berth around Elijah and Aiyana. The balance of tension began to ease, yet the stakes remained high. Aiyana moved slightly forward, her eyes never leaving Makya's. Though she spoke no words, her posture communicated understanding in agreement with Elijah's statements. Together, they had navigated the dangerous interplay of intent perception and morality. Their silent coordination had preserved not only their lives, but the fragile possibility of trust. Elijah exhaled slowly, allowing himself a brief moment of relief. The first phase of negotiation had succeeded. Communication had bridged the gap between fear and understanding, between suspicion and trust. Yet the scale of the encircling force, the presence of hundreds of mounted riders, and the unpredictable dynamics of the Wild West reminded him that the challenge was far from over. Makya raised his hand again, signaling his riders to maintain position, but to remain passive. "You may return to your shelter for now," he said. "We will observe. Peace is fragile. Respect it, and it may endure. Threaten it, and you will face consequences." Elijah nodded, signaling Aiyana to move with him toward the relative safety of the cabin and the ridge. Every step was deliberate, measured, and silent. The tension had not dissipated, but a tenuous understanding had been established. They had navigated the perilous test of communication and emerged with a clearer view of the intentions surrounding them. As they reached the partial cover of the cabin and ridge, Elijah allowed himself a moment to glance back at the riders. Hundreds of figures remained spread across the plains, yet their posture had shifted from aggressive testing to cautious observation. The siege was not over, but the first dialogue had been conducted successfully. They had survived the moral, strategic, and psychological tests of the morning. Aiyana settled beside him, her eyes still scanning the horizon. Elijah reached out briefly, placing a hand near hers, a gesture of solidarity and shared relief. Words were unnecessary. They had faced a force larger than themselves and maintained integrity, courage, and clarity. Yet even as they caught their breath, Elijah could feel the tension returning. The plains held many unknowns, and the riders, though temporarily restrained, remained a force of potential conflict. The test of understanding had succeeded, but the storm was far from over. And in the quiet aftermath of communication, a new question arose. Would the fragile peace endure, or would the next movement ignite the fire of confrontation? The sun had climbed higher, warming the plains with a gentle golden heat that belied the tension that had stretched across the morning. Elijah Turner and Aiyana remained perched behind the ridge, observing the encircling riders. Yet now there was a subtle change in the air, a shift in posture, in demeanor, in the rhythm of movement. The rigid discipline of the mounted force had softened slightly. Curiosity and cautious respect had replaced immediate hostility. Elijah allowed himself a slow breath, keeping his rifle at the ready, yet lowering the tension in his shoulders. Aiyana mirrored his movements, eyes scanning the horizon, fingers poised but relaxed. The negotiation had succeeded, but they knew better than to assume that this fragile understanding would last indefinitely. The plains demanded constant vigilance. Makya, the leader, emerged from the central ridge, riding slowly toward the clearing near the cabin. His expression was unreadable, yet his eyes held a measure of acknowledgement. Elijah adjusted his stance, signaling subtly to Aiyana that they would step forward, not in aggression, but in readiness to accept the next phase of dialogue. "We have observed you," Makya said, voice carrying across the plain, calm but authoritative. "Your actions have shown restraint and respect. That is noted, yet the rules of the land and the safety of our people remain paramount. You have acted with honor, and for that you will be allowed a measure of protection." Elijah exhaled slowly, relief mingling with caution. "We are grateful," he said, keeping his voice steady. "We seek only to protect each other and live without conflict. We respect your people and the laws of the land." Aiyana's eyes flicked to him, a silent affirmation of agreement. She had not spoken a word since the initial confrontation, yet her presence and composure carried as much weight as any statement could. Makia's gaze swept the surrounding plains, then rested briefly on Aiyana. "She is yours to protect while she remains on this land, provided that her welfare is not compromised and that her people's traditions are respected," he said. His words were measured, yet they carried authority and the weight of cultural expectation. Elijah nodded, understanding the responsibility now resting squarely upon his shoulders. The riders surrounding them shifted slightly, a subtle relaxation of posture that suggested a cautious acceptance of Elijah and Aiyana's position. While the tension had not vanished, the initial threat had been diffused. The siege for now had ended not through force, but through the measured communication, restraint, and mutual understanding of the parties involved. Elijah moved slightly forward, rifle lowered completely, showing trust without losing readiness. He glanced at Aiyana, who met his gaze with dark, unwavering eyes. They had survived the moral, strategic, and psychological tests of the past hours, emerging intact while preserving the lives of those around them. The lessons of patience, vigilance, and integrity had been tested to their limits. From the ridge, Makia signaled his riders to gradually loosen the encirclement, giving Elijah and Aiyana space to move and breathe. Dust swirled in gentle columns as horses shifted the plains, seeming to release a collective exhale. Elijah noted each subtle movement, aware that the window of safety was narrow and that any miscalculation could reignite tension. Aiyana moved closer to him, a silent gesture of shared relief and unity. Though she had spoken no words, the understanding between them was complete. They had survived the siege, not through aggression, but through observation, communication, and the moral courage to act with integrity. The bond forged in silence and vigilance had proven stronger than the threat posed by hundreds of riders. Elijah exhaled once more, allowing a brief smile to touch his weathered face. The tension of the past hours began to dissolve, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. Yet he knew the plains could be unpredictable, and the lessons of survival demanded that one never grow complacent. He cast a glance toward the horizon, where the ridges and valleys stretched endlessly golden and merciless under the midday sun. Makia approached a little closer, dismounting from his horse with deliberate precision. He walked toward the neutral ground between the ridge and the cabin, his steps measured, his eyes assessing, yet respectful. "Your actions have spoken louder than words," he said, addressing both Elijah and Aiyana. "You have shown that honor and courage are not bound by the blood you carry, but by the choices you make. For that, your lives and her welfare will be protected while you remain here." Elijah nodded slowly, voice steady. "We will honor this trust," he said. "Every action we take will reflect the responsibility you have placed upon us." He glanced at Aiyana, who inclined her head subtly in acknowledgement. Together, they embodied the combination of survival instincts, strategic judgment, and moral integrity that had allowed them to navigate this trial successfully. Makia extended a hand slightly in a gesture of respect, then signaled to his riders. The mounted figures began to shift, some turning back toward the ridges, others maintaining a watchful distance, but no longer encircling. The immediate threat had passed. The siege had ended without bloodshed, without unnecessary violence, a testament to negotiation, understanding, and measured courage. Elijah and Aiyana allowed themselves to step fully from the ridge, moving toward the cabin and the small patch of relative safety that now felt both fragile and precious. The plains remained vast and unyielding, but for this moment they had achieved a reprieve. The riders had recognized their integrity, and through the quiet demonstration of trust and strategic understanding, a dangerous confrontation had been averted. As they reached the cabin, Elijah set down the rifle shoulders, relaxing slightly while still tense from the hours of alertness. Aiyana remained poised, eyes scanning the horizon even as she moved closer to him, a silent acknowledgement of shared triumph and cautious vigilance. They had survived a test of morality, strategy, and courage, emerging intact despite the overwhelming odds and the potential for disaster. Elijah's gaze swept the plains one last time, noting the retreating riders, the dust rising in the sunlight, and the endless expanse of land that both protected and threatened. "We've made it for now," he said quietly, "but we must remain vigilant. The world doesn't forgive carelessness, and the Wild West has a long memory." Aiyana tilted her head slightly, a silent affirmation. Their partnership, forged in the crucible of uncertainty and danger, had proven its worth. Together, they had navigated the complex interplay of survival, morality, and communication. The siege had tested every instinct, every choice, and every ounce of courage they possessed, and they had prevailed without yielding to violence or despair. As the wind swept across the plains, carrying the scent of dust sage and horses, Elijah felt a rare sense of accomplishment tempered by caution. The conflict had been resolved for now, but the lessons of the Wild West were enduring. Trust was fragile, courage was essential, and understanding, whether spoken or unspoken, could determine life or death. For a brief moment, the plains felt peaceful. Elijah and Aiyana stood together, a small island of calm in the vast, unforgiving landscape. They had survived the siege, earned a measure of respect, and demonstrated that honor and courage could bridge even the widest divides. And, though the horizon remained endless, the threat ever present, they had proven that careful observation, moral integrity, and trust could tip the scales in their favor. But even in this fleeting reprieve, Elijah knew the lessons of the day would endure. The Wild West demanded constant awareness, and the balance between survival and compassion would be tested again. And yet for now, the immediate danger had passed, replaced by a tenuous trust, a fragile respect, and the quiet acknowledgement that they had emerged stronger for it. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting long golden shadows across the endless plains. Elijah Turner and Aiyana stood side by side on the ridge, the cabin behind them bathed in warm light, a fragile sanctuary amid the vast, unforgiving landscape. The siege had ended, the riders had retreated, and a delicate peace settled over the land. Yet even in this moment of reprieve, Elijah knew that the plains demanded vigilance. Survival was never guaranteed. The Wild West held no mercy for the careless or unprepared. Elijah lowered his rifle, allowing himself a rare exhale. His chest tightened, not from fear, but from the enormity of the events they had endured. The morning's tension, the moral dilemmas, the strategic retreats, and the ultimate confrontation with Makya and his riders had tested every instinct, every choice, and every ounce of courage he possessed. And yet, through it all, he had remained steadfast, not alone, but alongside Aiyana, whose silent strength had been as essential as any weapon or tactic. Aiyana moved closer to him, her dark eyes scanning the horizon, even as her presence radiated calm assurance. Elijah felt a surge of gratitude and respect. She had navigated the terrain, anticipated threats, and provided a steady counterbalance to his own experience and judgment. Together they had faced overwhelming odds, and together they had emerged not only intact, but with the beginnings of trust and understanding that transcended words. The plains stretched endlessly before them, golden and merciless under the descending sun. Elijah took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of sagebrush, dry earth, and the faint hint of distant smoke. The world was vast and indifferent, yet in that expanse they had carved a small space of safety and understanding. He glanced at Aiyana, noting the way she held herself poised, yet relaxed, alert, yet calm. Her presence was a testament to resilience, courage, and the quiet power of moral integrity. They began to descend toward the cabin together, moving carefully across the uneven ground, their steps deliberate and measured. The dust that had swirled around the riders' horses earlier now settled in the air, leaving a crisp clarity that revealed the landscape in sharp detail. Elijah noticed the small ways Aiyana interacted with the environment, how she stepped lightly over rocks, how she avoided loose soil that could give away their movements, how she maintained an unbroken line of sight toward potential threats. Every action communicated intelligence, experience, and trustworthiness. Inside the cabin, the air felt different, less tense, more open, yet still filled with the quiet reminders of the morning's events. Elijah set down his rifle and ran a hand over the worn wood of the table, reflecting on the choices they had made. The siege had been resolved not through brute force, but through observation, communication, and moral courage. Every decision, from offering Aiyana food to navigating the standoff with Makya's riders, had been a test of character as much as skill. Aiyana moved to a corner near the window, scanning the horizon once more. Elijah watched her, realizing that her silence had never been a handicap. It had been a source of strength. Her ability to read the land, the riders, and the subtle signals of intent had guided them through the most dangerous moments. He felt a profound respect for her resilience and wisdom. She had taught him silently that courage was not always loud, and that understanding could bridge even the widest divides. The sun continued its descent, painting the cabin in hues of amber and gold. Elijah stepped closer to the window, glancing once more toward the ridge where the riders had paused their formation. Though the immediate threat had receded, the lessons of the day remained vivid. He understood now more clearly than ever that the Wild West was a place where morality, strategy, and courage were tested constantly, and that trust, rare, fragile, and precious, was often the difference between life and death. Aiyana shifted slightly, moving to stand beside him. Their shoulders brushed a subtle connection that spoke volumes without words. In the silence of the cabin, the weight of their shared experience settled between them. The partnership they had forged through peril, observation, and moral courage was now unspoken but undeniable. Each had relied on the other's strength, instincts, and judgment. Each had respected the other's boundaries and capabilities, and together they had navigated a world that often demanded harsh choices and instantaneous action. Elijah lowered his gaze to the floor, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. The simple act of offering a meal to a stranger had set in motion a chain of events that neither he nor Aiyana could have predicted. That small gesture of compassion had tested them, challenged them, and ultimately led to a profound understanding of trust, courage, and the power of ethical action in a land defined by lawlessness and uncertainty. The plains outside shimmered in the late sunlight, the wind carrying the faint sound of distant birds and the rustle of dry grass. Elijah placed a hand gently near Aiyana's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of their shared triumph. She inclined her head slightly, an unspoken affirmation that they had survived, learned, and grown stronger together. As they prepared to settle for the evening, Elijah took a moment to glance toward the horizon, reflecting on the lessons of the day. The riders had tested their resolve, the land had demanded their vigilance, and every choice had carried weight. Yet through observation, patience, communication, and mutual respect, they had not only survived, but maintained their integrity. It was a rare victory in a world where choices were often harsh and outcomes uncertain. Aiyana stood silently beside him, eyes scanning the plains one last time. Elijah realized that her presence was a reminder of the enduring strength of the human spirit, the capacity for courage, resilience, and compassion, even in the most unforgiving circumstances. Together, they had faced overwhelming odds, navigated moral dilemmas, and emerged intact, their bond strengthened by every trial. The cabin grew quiet as the sun sank, lower shadows lengthening across the floor. Elijah allowed himself a brief smile, a rare expression of satisfaction tempered by awareness. The Wild West remained vast, unpredictable, and indifferent, but for this moment, they had carved out a space of safety, understanding, and shared triumph. The siege had ended, the conflict resolved, and a fragile peace had been established. Yet even in this quiet, Elijah knew the plains demanded vigilance. The lessons of courage, trust, and moral integrity would endure, shaping every choice and every step. He glanced at Aiyana once more, dark eyes reflecting both the light of the setting sun and the depth of experience that had guided them through the day. Together, they had survived not only the physical threats, but the psychological and moral challenges that had tested every fiber of their being. And as the wind whispered across the endless plains, Elijah understood that their journey was far from over. The Wild West held many more lessons, dangers, and opportunities for courage, but for now they had proven that trust, moral integrity, and resilience could bridge even the widest divides, and that compassion, no matter how small a gesture, could alter the course of destiny. In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Wild West, Elijah Turner and Aiyana remind us that true courage is not measured by strength alone, but by the choices we make in moments of uncertainty. Compassion, even in the smallest acts like sharing a meal or offering shelter, can ripple outward, creating trust, understanding, and connections that defy fear and danger. Life often tests us with impossible odds, moral dilemmas, and moments that demand patience and discernment. Yet it is in these moments when we act with integrity, empathy, and courage that we discover the depth of our own character. Their story teaches us that trust is fragile but powerful, that resilience is forged through challenges, and that even in a harsh world, acts of kindness can change destinies. Take a moment today to reflect, how can you extend compassion and courage in your own life? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your reflections in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire challenge and remind us of the strength of the human spirit.